Hello, everyone, and welcome to my channel. Here, I love to tell stories of the many Black military heroes that have inspired me. You may often hear me call them my ancestors. Although I have no proof of blood relation, it's important to note that the horrors of American slavery make it nearly impossible to know if any person of color is your distant relative. With families being split up and sold downriver in those days, it's hard to tell if the person you consider your friend or even your enemy is your kin. So I try to treat them as if they are all my ancestors because it's important and because it's possible some of them are. I enjoy telling people stories, and today I want to tell a special one that rings dear to my heart. Some of my stories do take time, so I advise that you grab your favorite beverage and snack, put on your headphones if you're in a hands-free environment, and enjoy. Today we're speaking about a hero from the Vietnam War era. Mr. Dwight H. Johnson was one of 22 African American Medal of Honor winners in the Vietnam War. Dwight was personally awarded the medal by President Lyndon B. Johnson in a White House ceremony on November 19, 1968, 10 months after a 30-minute fit of rage in which Dwight would carry out the actions that would lead him to earning our nation's highest honor for a serviceman. I wish this story was a story of triumph and glory, but it's not. Instead, it's a sad tale that deals with tough subject matter, such as racism, a lack of opportunities, PTSD, and even suicide. I must warn you that this has a sad ending, one that we should all know and try our best to learn from. Dwight Howe Skip Johnson grew up in Detroit, Michigan. Born to a single teenage mother on May 7, 1947, Skip was raised by his mom in the Jeffries housing projects in the 1950s and 60s with his younger brother. The Jeffries projects were well known in Detroit, but by the 1960s, they had already become a haven for crime and drugs. Despite growing up in a tough neighborhood, Dwight was often described as being a very good young man, and during his childhood earned the nickname Skip, which stuck with him through adulthood. Skip was noted to be an altar boy in church and a Boy Scout that rose in the ranks to Explorer Scout. He was also protective of his younger brother, pictured here on the lower left. As one of the good kids, his mother, who's also pictured here, noted that he was often chased home after school by bullies in a nearby neighborhood called Corktown. Skip's mother always taught him to never let the bullies get to him, and to always avoid losing his composure and fighting them. Skip, always the good son, assured his mother that he would never let them get to him, instead suppressing his anger over these incidents and not holding the bullies to account. By the time Skip hit his teenage years, America was experiencing turbulent times. It was a time of change, of revolution. To some degree, Black America was in a state of insurgency after centuries of oppression. Northern ghettos had erupted in protest, and if they felt they weren't being heard, cities erupted in flames. The civil rights and Black power movements were in full swing, and powerful Black voices like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael spoke out against compliance and suppression of anger against bullies. These powerful Black figures often dominated the thoughts and ideals of many young Black men in those times, which starkly contrasted with the more moderate civil rights approach of Dr. King. The Vietnam War was not really a daily conversation for most Americans by the year 1966, but it had been in full swing for nearly 2 years. It was during 1966, like so many kids from low-income families in inner cities and rural areas, that Skip, at the age of 19, was drafted into the U.S. Army. After going through basic training, Skip was assigned to a tank platoon who would train as a tanker for the next several months, soon joining the 1st Battalion, 69th Armored Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, and eventually being sent to Vietnam as a tank driver. Skip was often described as easygoing and hard to upset. A white friend from his unit recalled that other white soldiers would try to rattle him since he was one of the only black soldiers in their platoon. Yet, he always seemed to be unfazed by this. He would laugh off even the most disturbing racial insults. This is unthinkable in 2023, and may have been for that time as well. But once his white comrades realized they couldn't rattle him, he was immediately accepted and became one of the more well-liked men in the unit. During his first 11 months and 22 days in Vietnam, Skip and his tank platoon spent much of their time patrolling roadways. During this time, Skip would fortunately not experience a single instance of combat. It should be noted that the Vietnam War was often fought in very rugged mountainous terrain or jungle. Unlike the wide open fields and steppes of Europe, where American tankers thrived during World War II, tankers in Vietnam certainly experienced their share of combat, but not on the same wide scale as World War II. In fact, much of their combat occurred in the narrow streets and roads of villages, towns, or cities. There, they often provided a show of strength against their enemies, along with close-range fire support or short-range artillery for the infantry they supported. They sometimes patrolled areas that had heavy enemy activity, and sometimes becoming the victims of ambushes. Skip's platoon was armed with heavy M48 Patton tanks like seen here, that were supposed to be resistant to anti-tank weapons. However, on January 15th, 1968, just a few days before the famous Tet Offensive, they were ambushed by waves of communist soldiers. The night before, Skip had been moved from his old tank crew to take the place of a sick driver in another tank. Taken away from his best buddies of nearly a year, men he'd hung out with and got to know personally, Skip likely felt that this patrol would not be any different than any other day. If he felt that way, he was wrong. The following description of what Skip experienced that fateful day is taken from a New York Times article from 1971 about Skip. In the article, Skip's tank mate and gunner on that day, Stan Ender, remembered Skip's actions. I quote, "No one who was there could ever forget the sight of this guy taking on a whole battalion of North Vietnamese soldiers. Their platoon of 4 M48 tanks was racing down a road toward Dak To, in the central highlands near the Cambodian border and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, when it was ambushed. Communist rockets knocked out 2 of the tanks immediately, and waves of foot soldiers sprang out of the nearby woods to attack the 2 tanks still in commission. Skip's tank had lost a track, therefore making his job as a tank driver useless. He hoisted himself out of the turret hatch and manned the 50 caliber machine gun on top of the tank, similar to what you see here. 60 feet away from him was his old tank, the tank with his best buddies, and it was burning." I quote, "He was really close to those guys in that tank," Stan said. "He just couldn't sit still and watch it burn with them inside." Skip ran through heavy crossfire to the tank and opened its hatch. He pulled out the first man he came across in the turret, burned but still alive, and got him to the ground, just as that tank's artillery shells exploded, killing everyone else left inside. Stan said, "When the tank blew up, Dwight saw the bodies all burned and black, and well, he just sort of cracked up. For 30 minutes, armed with a .45 caliber pistol and then with a submachine gun, Skip hunted the North Vietnamese soldiers on the ground, killing an estimated 5 to 20 of them, but nobody knows the official count for sure. When he ran out of ammunition, he even killed one with the stock of his submachine gun." Stan was later quoted saying, "At one point, Skip came face to face with a communist soldier who squeezed the trigger on his AK-47 as he aimed point blank at Skip's face. However, the gun misfired and Dwight killed him. But that enemy soldier would come back to haunt Skip late at night in Detroit. In those dreams in which that anonymous soldier stood in front of him, the barrel of his AK-47 as big as a railroad tunnel, his finger on the trigger, slowly pressing it. When it was all over, Stan said, it took 3 men and 3 shots of morphine to hold Dwight down. He was raving. He tried to kill all the prisoners we had rounded up. They had to take him away to a hospital in Pleiku in a straitjacket. Stan saw Skip the next day. He had been released from the hospital and came by camp to pick up his personal gear. He told Stan his Vietnam tour was over and that he was going home. Let's explore this a bit. For 30 minutes, Skip Johnson, the often quiet, well-mannered, easygoing kid from the rough streets of Detroit, whom always seemed to keep his cool, completely lost it that day. The sudden overwhelming trauma of combat, loss of close friends, fear, and the need for survival must have hit him all at once. All that Skip was, all that he had been before that day, was eradicated in those 30 minutes of hell. It would change Skip for the rest of his life. With nearly 12 months of his Vietnam tour up and the chaotic events of January 15th under his belt, Skip was summarily sent home to Detroit with about $600 in his pocket. A lot of cash for back then, especially for a kid from the projects, and most likely zero support for his mental health. Skip did like most young men were expected to do back then. He tried to put the trauma behind him, and he didn't speak about it. He was home now and could spend time with his family or go hang out on the town with his friends, going out to bars and meeting girls like any normal 21-year-old would. When his friends would ask him about his Vietnam experience over drinks, he always downplayed it, focusing on the 11 months of no direct combat and the soft side of Army life, like R&R and his friends, never focusing on the darkest 30 minutes of his life, where he lost those friends, he lost control, he lost who he was. Although Skip appeared to be the same easygoing self on the outside, on the inside, he was suffering. Although job opportunities were limited for young black men in Detroit in those days, some did still exist. But Skip did not seem to have the motivation to go out and push for new job opportunities. Instead, he often drove with friends to job interviews, but would not go through the interview process himself. Although Skip was very bright, noted to have a 120 IQ score, he would sometimes submit to the pressure of going on a job interview, but purposely botch it. Finally, in October 1968, his home was visited by 2 military policemen. This caused some initial alarm for Skip, as he was no longer part of the U.S. Army. Why were they here? He likely thought to himself. He'd quickly learn that they were there to find out if he'd been arrested since his discharge earlier that year. Weird. When he confirmed that he'd not been arrested, the MP summarily left. Weirder. He then received a phone call 15 minutes later, letting him know he'd won the Medal of Honor for his actions back in January, and that he'd need to receive it in a publicly televised ceremony in Washington, D.C. This was a lot for the quiet and easygoing Skip to accept. He was done with his time in the Army and was now working towards putting all that trauma behind him. But ever the good son, his thoughts surely turned to his mother, who was clearly proud of him for this, and good sons often want to keep their moms proud. During the televised ceremony on November 19, 1968, Skip stood up straight in front of President Johnson while an officer read off his act of valor from the January 15th ambush. While this was an amazing story of bravery to some, to Skip, it was a step-by-step, public retelling of the worst day of his life, tearing open old wounds that had slowly begun to scab. President Johnson placed the medal around Skip's neck. When Skip's mother noticed him crying while on the receiving line, she whispered, "Honey, what are you crying about? You made it back." Sadly, a large piece of Skip did not make it back home from Vietnam. The happy-go-lucky kid now went from being just another no-name, unemployed Vietnam vet to becoming the first African American recipient of the Medal of Honor from Michigan during the war and the pride of the city of Detroit. Places that had ignored his previous efforts for employment now were interested in employing him. Neighborhood kids that might have chased him back in the day wanted to be like him. Most interested in Skip, however, was his old employer, the U.S. Army. They now had a Black Medal of Honor winner in a city that was a large source of their manpower for the war. With Skip's compliance and assistance, they would use his face and his words to attract many more poor kids from Detroit to the U.S. Army. Skip needed a job and accepted a position with the U.S. Army as a recruiter and a new promotion to sergeant. Part of his job responsibility now in this role was to speak at events across the state of Michigan and the city of Detroit. Military events, schools, and public ceremonies are just a few of the places where the usually easygoing Skip was now expected to be the headliner. During these events, he was often expected to rehash and relive his trauma. Skip was in no way proud of the events of January 15th, and now having been awarded and praised for it, caused tremendous sense of guilt for Skip. He endured this as long as he could, as the new job was paying the bills and allowing him to purchase new cars, rent better apartments, and have enough financial stability to support his new family and his wife Katrina. But as 1969 passed, then 1970, Skip slowly ducked more inward and started to slack on many of his job responsibilities. He wouldn't show up on time to speaking engagements, sometimes ignoring them completely. Skip had some interesting experiences as a recruiter with a Medal of Honor attached to his name, like meeting the Detroit Tigers at the Tiger Stadium, or being the guest of honor at dozens of balls and banquets hosted and attended by the likes of President Richard Nixon and General William Westmoreland, who commanded all U.S. forces in Vietnam. But he also had many unfortunate experiences as well. A lot of the business executives, politicians, and community leaders he met, black or white, patted him on the back and praised him, and would often make wild promises of job opportunities and employment. When Skip would later reach out to those individuals, he often found himself having to remind them who he was, and the opportunities would never transpire. A series of incidents that really impacted Skip during this time occurred when he went to speak at black high schools. Several times, his speaking engagements were picketed by quote unquote black militants that jeered him as being an electronic Negro, a robot programmed to recruit blacks to go fight in a war against Asians that had never done anything to black people. In many ways, Skip felt let down by the U.S. Army and may have actually agreed with what these picketers were saying about him. It just became yet another deep wound for Skip to worry about. As Skip grew more noticeably depressed, at one point, he was sent to a veteran psychiatric hospital not far from Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. There he met with a specialized psychiatrist that was attempting to help him through counseling. But it was not enough. Skip was suffering from survival guilt, after all, and his friends had been burned to death in that tank, and PTSD from the violence he experienced in killing those other people. In every interview or speaking engagement, he was seeing the faces of his dead friends and reliving the trauma of the day he completely lost it. His mother had always told him not to let the bullies catch him, so that way he wouldn't have to fight back. Yet on January 15th, 1968, he couldn't run. He did what he had to do, despite his lifelong programming that had kept him even keeled. After a short stint in the psych ward, he was noticed as having gone AWOL, and shortly after, returning on his own volition. On his return back, his psychiatrist is again quoted in the following passage from the 1971 New York Times article describing his combat experience. Subject is bright. His Army GT rating is the equivalent of 120 IQ. In his first interviews, he does not volunteer information. He related he grew up in a Detroit ghetto and never knew his natural father. He sort of laughed when he said he was a good boy and did what was expected of him. The only time he could remember losing his temper as a youth was when neighborhood bullies picked on his younger brother. He was so incensed, grown-ups had to drag him off the other boys. In general, there is evidence the subject learned to live up to the expectations of others, while there was a buildup that he continually suppressed. There was further psychiatric evaluation. Since coming home from Vietnam, the subject has had bad dreams. He didn't confide in his mother or wife, but entertained a lot of moral judgment as to what had happened at Dak To. Why had he been ordered to switch tanks the night before? Why was he spared and not the others? He experienced guilt about his survival. He wondered if he was sane. It made him sad. It left him depressed. Skip ultimately could not take it at the facility and left on a 3-day pass to Philly in March 1971, never to return. He popped back up in Detroit several days later, but proceeded to dodge all calls to his home from the Army, who had again listed him as AWOL. At home, lonely and depressed, his bills went unpaid, and he for the most part kept to himself. Still reaching out to friends and loved ones, and when he did, he appeared as his same happy-go-lucky self, while deep inside, he was fighting a war, a major war, one that he was losing. At 9 p.m. on April 30th, 1971, Skip asked his friend Eddie from Detroit for a ride since he had recently lost access to his own vehicle. He claimed he needed the ride to go pick up some money from a guy down the road that owed him. Eddie, with his own stepfather and mother, picked up Skip at around 11 p.m. that night and drove him about a mile west into a white neighborhood. Feeling unease, Skip's friend Eddie and his parents waited for over 30 minutes after Skip got out the car. It seemed like quite a long time to go pick up cash from someone that owed him. The problem was, this was not Skip's real intention. Skip must have been tired. Tired of feeling the pain he was going through. Tired of fighting whatever demons he had inside of him, telling him he didn't deserve to live. We don't really know what was going through his head that night. But instead of going to confront an associate about money that was owed, he instead walked into a corner store, threatened the owner with a gun, telling him to give him all of his money. The owner was armed and fired at Skip in self-defense. Skip was hit twice, but didn't go down. Instead, he proceeded to threaten the owner even more. Fear must have triggered the man to fire again at Skip, this time bringing him down. The police were called, and some of the responding officers noticed a car full of black people not far down the street that stood out in the white neighborhood. When questioned, Eddie and his parents mentioned they were there waiting for Skip, only to be informed that Skip had been shot holding up a store down the road. Later that night, Skip would die of his wounds. The gun he carried that night was rumored to have no bullets in it. In 1971, in the New York Times article, Skip's psychiatrist recalled one of the interviews with him here. The subject remembered coming face to face with a Vietnamese with a gun. He could remember the soldier squeezing the trigger. The gun jammed. The subject has since engaged in some magical thinking about this episode. He also suffers guilt over surviving it, and later winning a high honor for the one time in his life when he lost complete control of himself. He asked, what would happen if I lost control of myself in Detroit and behaved like I did in Vietnam? The prospect of such an event apparently was deeply disturbing to him. Sadly, this would come to be reality, with Skip's mom later saying that she felt Skip grew tired of his life and needed someone else to pull the trigger. Although Skip's death shocked the community and the U.S. Army, they withheld Skip's honor and allowed him to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery amongst other honored heroes of America's past. Surely, this was an acknowledgement by the U.S. military that Skip was not himself when he did this. It was a man in severe pain, a man that made a decision that went against everything he stood for, and it was caused by the trauma he'd experienced. Skip was buried in Arlington National Cemetery on May 6, 1971, and his grave can still be found in Section 31, Lot 471. I warned you that this was a sad ending. Not all the stories of our heroes end in a positive note. I think it's important to tell these stories, though, as there are many of us that can relate to them. Many people of all backgrounds can relate to the suffering from some sort of PTSD and not feeling the rest of society properly acknowledges it. They can understand that you're feeling expected to be tough and compliant on the outside, while deeply suppressing emotions on the inside that are waiting to explode into something else. If only someone could have helped Skip sooner. If only the Army realized how traumatic it was for him to be forced to relive the worst day of his life. It's not useful to ask what if, but sometimes it cannot be helped. Skip, we are sorry this happened to you. We are sorry that you felt you'd lost all that you were fighting over there for your country. We are sorry that no one recognized this sooner and that you were forced to reopen those ugly wounds in order to support yourself and your family. And what we're most sorry for, Skip, is that the war within yourself was the last one you had to fight, and that you ultimately lost it. Yet, we are grateful for you and allowing us to share your story here today, especially with those who might need to hear it. And Skip, like all our ancestors, we honor you. We talked about some very, very serious topics today, which included suicide. If you or someone else that you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts and you need help, I humbly encourage you to reach out to the National Suicide Prevention and Support Lifeline. Thank you for listening, and be well.